Hello, everybody. Peter Temis here, founder and president of the Institute for Innovation in Large Organizations. This would ordinarily be our weekly Thursday recap. We have our 1 hour gathering of members, usually 40 to 50 folks, at 10 a.m. Pacific, 1 p.m. Eastern, for our weekly gathering point and conversation. This past week, we had the vital voice of Dr. Jonathan Ward. Since Jonathan is someone I've known for many years, I've had great respect for. He's an expert in US-China relations, in China-Indian relations, and in general, in kind of, great game, large power relations globally. Jonathan's voice has been quite important in the shaping of US policy, particularly in the last 7 or 8 years. He joined us this past Thursday with several really provocative and I think incredibly insightful things to say that folks on the call found very, very valuable. Jonathan, thank you for joining us for this brief recap.
Peter, thank you. Good to be with you.
So I'll put the question to you, John. What should someone at a senior level in a large US or European-based corporation, government agency, not-for-profit, be taking from what we've seen in Russia and Ukraine over the last 3-4 weeks?
I think really for the business executive in a large Fortune 500, the thing to understand is that your work is going to be more important than ever for reasons that you may not have anticipated. And that's because the multinational corporation is it may be the single most important unit of economic power in the United States and in the allied world. And right now, we're not yet treating them as such, and our executives aren't necessarily seeing their role in this broader context. Our crisis that absorbs us now, of course, is Russia's invasion of Ukraine. And with the atrocities that we're witnessing, I think we're coming to understand as a world that we're dealing with something bigger and broader than we expected. I mean, it's not only Russia, but it's also the China issue, which I've done my part to help explain to the world. But fundamentally, these are partner states. They're working together to overturn the US-led order. And it's not just Russia's, brutality and use of force that we have to contend with. It's also Chinese economic power that's supporting that and supporting their own ascendancy and program to redo the Indo-Pacific, Asia, and rebuild the world to their advantage. And these are, of course, very dangerous states that have terrible records on human rights. And that is a very long list, and we can understand that. But at the end of the day, the only way that we win this is by winning an economic contest. And in order to win an economic contest, we need our business leaders to understand how that contest works and what role they'll need to play. And I believe that fundamentally people must revise their strategies towards these authoritarian nations, towards Russia and China. Now we're seeing that in real time when it comes to Russia. The exodus of companies from Russia over the past 4 weeks has been extraordinary. It's an event which I think it may be hard to find parallels like that in modern history. But for most multinationals, the businesses that they've built in Russia are on one level much easier to abandon than the businesses they've built in China. Now, the analogy that I used on our call this week was, it's as though in Russia, you may have the appendix, in the body. And if you have to get your appendix removed, that's one thing. But in China, far too many companies in many different industries are building something akin to the central nervous system. China is becoming a vital organ in their global business strategy. And yet the Communist Party of China has military goals that are, maybe even surpass Russia's military goals. I mean, they have ambitions in the East China Sea, South China Sea, Taiwan, the Himalayas. They've built a military that we can all see. They've told us that they intend to use it. They're quite simply preparing for war with the United States. And at the same time, they have a strategy that allows them to source investment and technology from the US and from the West more broadly. So our companies are going into this thinking that they understand the risks, but I think we've just seen what it looks like for real geopolitical risk to manifest in the world. And the risks that people are taking on in China are, I think, far more dire than the ones that they're taking on anywhere else in the world. And at the end of the day, we're going to need our business leaders to come to the right side of history and play a very important role in rebuilding the sort of world alliance system and the economy that undergirds all of us in the free world. So preparing to do that should begin.
So I've heard you say recently that in some ways what we're seeing with Russia, and I think there are folks who are pleasantly surprised that European and American businesses are showing, in some ways the spine and the willingness to bear the cost of disengaging to at least a substantial degree. This ought to be a warning and a point of preparation for what we will likely need to do with China, and that the common tie is these are totalitarian, as you said, authoritarian regimes. Here we have regimes that are, on the one hand, morally abhorrent. We see the things they're doing that we ought not to get ourselves dirty in for the sake of profit. And we hear them saying they are our enemies, and yet our large corporations seem to be their partners too often. If this is the time to take stock and say, okay, we've now gotten burned, at our fingertips with Russia, let's not, self-immolate with China. Does that mean that today, therefore, today, tomorrow, next week, we really systematically start disengaging inside the large corporations from China, from supply chain, from intellectual property sharing and sourcing, from selling into their market? Is it that extreme?
I think the right thing to do is to scale back operations and exposure to the People's Republic of China. And it's a country that has told us absolutely in lucid terms that it intends to use force in its region, and including potentially against the United States. So for business leaders to be living in an entirely different world than what our military and intelligence leaders understand and what our governments understand, I think that's creating a dilemma that's going to impact all of us ultimately. So I think people do need to be prepared for disengagement with China. And I recognize that that runs totally against the grain of what most consultancies recommend, of what most, what's the norm in sort of, business thought leadership. I mean, China's thought of as an expanding, growing market, and yet the human rights abuses are tolerated. The statements of their leaders that tell us, I mean, they're blaming the current crisis on the United States. I mean, this is the kind of thing that you really have to close your eyes to a lot of things in order to believe that this is a good idea in the long run.
So I'm, let's say, hypothetically, either chief marketing officer or chief procurement officer for a Fortune 500. And I have my goals. I have my CEO who is neutral, right? He has stopped buying seashells and a little bit of whatever we were procuring in Russia, and gets applauded for that. But now I've got to source XYZ, including potentially technical talent. Or as a marketer, I'm looking for a 10% expansion of a market for some key products, and I see this growing middle class. China is a likely place to go. Is your advice to the chief information officer and the chief marketing officer to simply turn away from those sources of talent or that source of market expansion?
Let's look at the growth sort of market idea. I mean, I think that's one of the ones that, sort of dominates the conversation here. I mean, a lot of this is potentially theoretical. I mean, it's expanding now, but at the end of the day, China's national objectives are in fact to supplant Western corporations once they've achieved, technical and technological capability to do so. And that's in all of their national strategies. It's really everywhere. It's the entire idea is to bring technology and capital in from the West, and then through things like Made in China 2025 or dual circulation, to gradually increase their ability to supply it on their own, and then to repurpose it and send it into global markets. So part of the issue here is that it's not just a problem that stays inside the borders of China. At the end of the day, the state-owned enterprises and state-backed enterprises are going to go out to the world with technology that they've essentially, obtained from multinationals, and use that in global markets, being able to undercut people, and that's already taking place. So that's one aspect. But case by case by case, every company is exposed in a slightly different way, and will have to prioritize, I think, slightly differently to assess these risks and then take steps to mitigate them. But in the long run, I think, and we're already seeing this, I mean, we're seeing the way that, whether it's consumer goods like H&M, whether it's, big brands like Apple, I mean, everybody's getting in trouble in different ways in China already. And I think that story is robust and sort of easily understood. But I think what we have to understand is this is just the beginning of all that. I mean, when you're talking about a period of geopolitical conflict that's this consequential, the idea that you're going to ride this out somehow because it's a growing market, I think really needs to be re-examined. And I recognize that not everybody will do that, but those that do, those that take the steps to look at this differently, I think will be the long-term survivors, frankly.
Dr. Jonathan Ward, thank you so much. I know we'll be seeing you on the media, and I think we'll benefit from your impact on public policy and corporate decision-making. Always a pleasure to have you with us. And to the members of the Institute who will be viewing this, thank you all again for your participation every Thursday. Look forward to seeing you again. There's always a place for you at our table.